Alright, good evening, guys. Welcome to FST 4310, Week 3. We're going to talk about state and local regulations. Alright, so I have a few things to say about the agenda. Some references to Week 4 throughout this lecture. That's because originally I was planning to talk about nutrition label calculations this week. I made a decision both in terms of time and just because it just seemed to make more sense to move this particular lecture up to this week instead of the next one. Nutrition label calculation really deserves its own section, and so I bumped that up to next week. I apologize if this causes any confusion, but that's just a decision I made. We will still talk about regulatory considerations, which was the topic of this week's live lecture on Tuesday. That ties in very well to today's lecture and is a big part of the background that you'll need for today's lesson. That live lecture covered the federal regulations, the FDA, the USDA, laws that are enforced by them, 21 CFR and all that. But this will focus more on things that are just in the state of California, and in some cases, even the county of Los Angeles. At the end, I have some comments about how you can use this lesson for your project. You'll probably notice that there's no assignment for this pre-recorded lecture, because I already gave that assignment out on Tuesday, and the details have been fleshed out during that particular session. We even discussed potential extra credit opportunities. I'll post that assignment up on Canvas as soon as I complete this lecture. If you're missing notes on that assignment, exactly what that entails, what you need to do, when that's due, and how to submit it, don't worry, that will be up on Canvas this week. Alright, here's what we covered this week. We covered the roles of regulations in the food industry, so as I mentioned before, we focused on the various federal agencies out there, so the whole nation. We have agencies like the FDA and the USDA, which you should be familiar with as food scientists. And then you have some other agencies which also protect the food industry. Customs and Border Patrol controls imports and exports. The TTB controls alcohol. NOAA controls seafood. And freshwater fish and animals are the responsibility of the FWS, just to name a few. Another central point of that, and the one that carries most to this particular lecture, is that regulatory agencies, their purpose is to protect the interest of whatever entity it represents. Refer to any place, person, thing, or business. Define a specific entity in any sort of legal document, or when referring to any sort of government agency regulation, when a rule applies to a certain entity, for instance, that has some legal significance to it. So some of the many ways that this applies in the food industry include, say, for example, the FDA representing us by protecting food safety, or the USDA APHIS branch, which protects agriculture from all sorts of international pests, invasive species, diseases. So they represent a lot of farmers, ranchers, growers, and what have you. We spend a lot of time establishing the significance of these federal agencies representing the food industry across the country. That segs great into this particular presentation because we're now focusing at the state and local level. And this rule that these agencies represent their entities and then they protect the interests, that holds true at this level too. And so that's the point of this lecture. Don't worry too much about the supplier approval programs right now. We will worry about that next week. So trust me, we will cover it. Having said that, some of the stuff that you'll see here will apply to that lecture, so I'll point that out when the time comes. Right, and this slide pretty much reiterates what I stated during the live lecture. Federal agencies have jurisdiction over multiple aspects of the food industry across the entire nation, and they focus on something called interstate commerce. So in this context, this is any sort of business transaction across state lines. For instance, if you were working for a peanut butter factory in Georgia and you bought peanuts from, let's say, Alabama, that would be interstate commerce. And the regulation extends to any sort of business done between different countries as well. As for examples of the responsibilities, some of these I did bring up before, but I'm still going to add to that list. U.S. regulations can be pretty complicated. A lot of small businesses in particular, but really everybody, need some instruction as to how to exactly comply with regulations, especially as they change. At the national level, federal agencies give guidances. These would often be downloadable documents or pages on the federal agency's website, and almost be like a handbook for how to comply with the law. As a matter of fact, that's basically how I taught myself to do my job at all the 3 places I worked at. Just to clear up any potential confusion, guidances are different from guidelines. Guidelines is being a set of rules, essentially, that a company must follow, or product requirements that it must meet. and then guidances are more of like advice on how to do it. All right, now we can get into the nitty gritty of the federal versus the state and local. So I already talked about the fact that the federal controls commerce across state lines, and that the state and local controls things within their own states or within their own counties or cities. Let's talk about the other differences. One big difference is what types of businesses are under their jurisdictions. Federal agencies like the USDA and the FDA are mostly concerned with factories, farms, distributors, warehouses, that sort of thing. Importers as well. Contrasts, state and local governments can control those, but they might focus on other things as well. Inspections of restaurants are done by local governments. Those same agencies may inspect hospitals, grocery stores, schools, swimming pools, golf clubs, all done by the same local health department. Actually, going back to the level of jurisdictions that the federal and the state/local governments have, in a lot of cases, states and local governments may desire to actually exert additional controls on certain things. They would do this if they feel that certain federal restrictions are not strict enough, or maybe there's some certain holes in the Code of Federal Regulations that they wish to fill. Or maybe there are no federal guidelines at all and they have to decide for themselves. It actually gets to the point where there might be actually a state equivalent to that federal agency. As an example, California has its own state agricultural marketing branch. It enforces a law very similar to PACA that the USDA Marketing Services enforces. Same way that PACA requires fair business practices among farmers and growers and produce sellers nationwide, well, the California Marketing Branch enforces that within the state of California. Having applied for both permits on the behalf of my company at one of my jobs, I can attest to you that the California process is tougher. Not only that, the law that is covered under the California Produce Dealers Act, it protects a lot more commodities in the agricultural industry. And USDA PACA licensing is mainly concerned with fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables, whereas the state California Marketing Branch license covers not only that, but also processed fruits and vegetables, dried fruits and vegetables, just about everything under the sun, even rice. I guess another more clear-cut example would be something like foie gras. Foie gras is illegal in California, whereas it's legal in other states. On the flip side, there may be no federal guidelines for a certain food, or they may be too stringent for that state. So some things that are banned nationally, like across the country, are sometimes very economically important to that state. And so they go out of their way to try to legalize it. The one that you're probably most familiar with in terms of examples would be marijuana. That's a big one. But let me give you another one. Raw milk is technically illegal in interstate commerce. So the FDA bans it. But within certain states, raw milk is legal. Out of curiosity, while recording this, I went ahead and looked at the article that you see in that text box there. And it seems that 11 states allow milk to be sold in any retail store. California is actually one of them. Whereas another 17 only allow it at the farm in which it's produced. So they can sell it, but no one else can. 8 have some sort of agreement, which admittedly seems kind of weird to me, where you have to kind of like quote-unquote rent a cow from a farmer and milk it for yourself. And the remaining 20 outright ban it. By the way, the push and pull between state and local governments and federal governments allowing or banning certain foods, that's a really good topic to talk about for your essay. But not least, if a permit is a state permit, it's only good for that state. Hopefully that's obvious. A federal permit should be good anywhere in the country. Just don't forget that certain states are stricter on certain things than the rest of the nation. And in those cases, a state permit is needed in addition to a federal one. Another thing that is controlled by the state governments is the utilities. In this case, the water quality and safety. Now, the water is actually controlled centrally by the state government, but the individual responsibilities for carrying it out, the daily tasks involved in maintaining the safety and quality, as well as lab tests, that is issued locally. So while there's a state of California water board, there will be a branch in each city controlled by the city government that would actually do the testing and the maintenance. Now, how does this tie to your work in QA? Well, the cleanliness and the potability of water that is used in the facility is a factor in food safety. So every year I actually had to collect data from the city government or even have our water tested by a company that can do that for us to pass inspections. Now, in the live lecture this week, I did mention that a lot of federal agencies grant permits. But if you want to be qualified for a specific job, that's state regulated. Handling food, for instance, ServSafe is a big one. My ServSafe actually didn't expire yet in California when I moved to Pennsylvania for grad school. And before I was even allowed to serve food at Penn State, I had to go through the ServSafe training again. That would also be the case for, say, a pest control technician. Their licenses are only good in the states that issued them. If you want to open a factory or a warehouse that specifically deals with food, you have to have a state license for that. In California, these are called state processed food registrations. Actually, California in particular has separate licenses for general manufacturing and organic manufacturing. Side note, California has its own organic program in addition to the USDA's. States also issue hunting and fishing licenses. If your company does any hunting or fishing, then this license is required. Actually, if you sell fish at all in California, you have to have a fishing license. I know because I filled out those applications. And the local level covers a lot of different things. If you ever wanted to open a business, it's often done through a county office or a city government. So this includes business permits for factories and warehouses, of course. But on top of that, this also applies to just about anything else. If you open a grocery store or a bar or a charter school or an arcade or, say, an electronics store, you need a business permit. Even that could get complicated because if you are a business that sells things or like products specifically, you have to determine whether or not you're a wholesale or retail business. Remember, your customers are not always individuals. They can be other businesses. Need a refresher? The first lecture is on this channel. Anytime you have to pay a sales tax on something you buy, that's imposed by your local government. So things like alcohol, restaurant service, those are very common. For any business where illness is a potential concern, especially ones where there's a potential environment for spreading disease, need what is called a public health permit. So your factories and your warehouses need them, yes, but your restaurants, your hotels, your swimming pools, hospitals, any business that prepares food or lumps a lot of people in together for certain activities, such as that pool, those all fall under that umbrella. Not only that, but by law, that public health permit has to be displayed on the front of any business. I'd show you an example, but unfortunately the internet doesn't seem to have any for some reason. It's kind of surprising. But if you try to Google it, just one note, it's not the same thing as a sign that you see at the front of the restaurant with a letter grading. That's something else. Though admittedly, those things are locally regulated too. Local governments also conduct food safety inspections and enforcement in restaurants, retail and grocery stores. But they actually have their own level of authority when it comes to food manufacturing and distribution also. So just in the same way that an FDA inspector can come into your facility if they suspect something, so too can a local health inspector. But again, if you want to know the difference between the two, you have to remember the key reasons that they'll be there. So if the FDA or USDA comes to your facility, that's usually a bad sign that they really suspect some wrongdoing, or they want to take a sample to make sure you're compliant. The local governments tend to do more routine inspections, and sometimes they'll come by surprise. That actually happened to us once at my first job. If the state government suspects something from something that's sold within their state and made within their state, so again, intra-state commerce, then a state inspector could come in. They might also come in for things that might be related to permits. There will be an audit prior to the approval of a California processed food registration, for instance. And again, don't forget, as I said earlier, federal agencies are limited to the specific industries that they focus on. So like FDA focuses on food, pharma, medical devices. The USDA focuses on agriculture and meat manufacturing. And specifically the industrial side of it, like factories, warehouses, importers, farms. Local health departments pretty much cover everything that might apply to any sort of health in general. An FDA inspector is never going to shut down the Taco Bell that's near your house. That's always going to be a local health inspector. Now, while we're on the subject of state governments, let's talk about a very important state law that you have to follow here in California. And it's one that's actually so important, in my opinion, that even if you end up moving to another state to get a job, you still have to take this into consideration. There are a lot of hazardous chemicals and substances out there. Even for the ones that don't kill you right away, repeated exposure to them can cause cancer, or, say, if you're a pregnant woman, could cause birth defects. Substances out there can even render some people less fertile, cause some sort of fertility issues. As a consumer of various goods, including food, cleaning supplies, and other chemical-heavy substances and items that you regularly use at home, you have the right to know whether or not these things are in your products. Therefore, it should be the responsibility of businesses to let the consumers know whether or not they are, in fact, in the products that they sell. Do you agree? Great. Then in 1986, you might have voted in favor of this Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act. That was Proposition 65 in that election, hence its current name. Alternately, you could have very reasonably voted no as well. I can tell you, having worked on projects where I had to keep track of all of the foods that we sell and determining whether or not Proposition 65 applies to them, that this sort of thing can be a huge pain in the butt for someone in the food industry. And really most industries, actually. We're not the only ones. You or someone you love and care about may own a small business, and they may just not have the resources to comply with this law. Or maybe you're just the type of person who thinks people panic too much and that these warnings are all like sort of a waste of money and time. Definitely a valid topic for your essay. Whatever your opinion may be, the fact stands that because of this law, products sold in California that may contain substances that apply to this law, and it's a lot of them because there's 900 different chemicals that fall under this list. If there's any potential for those chemicals to cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm, a warning label is required. And at least on paper, the main government organization responsible for administering it is the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHHA. Now, yes, I will elaborate on why that's only the case on paper in a bit, but let me talk about some other stuff first, and I'll address it then. Now, a business can comply with Prop 65 in many different ways. A business can post a sign out in the front window. They can put a sign near the products that are subject to this regulation. As a food scientist, the most common way you'll see it is on the labels of your products. These are the components that must absolutely be on your label. See that warning symbol on the top left there? That's required on every Prop 65 warning label. It's designed to grab the consumer's attention when they start taking a look at the product. Then after that warning sign, you have the warning proper, so this product can expose you to chemicals, including the following. And what kind of chemical is actually relevant to this regulation? That's the second component that is required. As far as I know, you have to list all of the relevant chemicals. That may seem like a lot, but in most cases, for food at least, it's only ever one or two at most. That's followed by the next part, which is known to the state of California, to cause cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. That leads us to our final key component, the web address of the Prop 65 Warnings website. So, if this regulation applies to a product you work with, it must have this label, and it must have these components. So what are the consequences of neglecting this regulation or not paying attention to it? Well, in practice, most of it's financial, and this is why I said the OEHHA enforces it on paper, but in reality, most of the impact it comes from when law groups and consumer advocate groups try to file a lawsuit onto companies. The OEHHA is more for like setting guidelines for the regulation. They might change some rules for the labels and stuff like that. But yeah, it just isn't them that you have to worry about. It's the legal firms. Actually, my supervisor from my first job, prior to working for that company, she had worked for several Chinese companies, which sold a lot of ginger treats. It was basically a type of ginger candy. And basically around the period that she was working there were a lot of lawsuits filed. So basically what happens is these consumer advocate groups, they'll have someone come into the grocery store, buy these candies. They might either discover that the sort of product applies to that regulation, and they might file a lawsuit against the grocery store, or they might trace all the way back to the manufacturer and sue them. The good news is that this is not really a criminal case, so people don't go to jail for neglecting this regulation. The bad news is that it's a civil case, and so it's more of a financial consequence. The consumer advocate groups and law firms can be extremely aggressive, and it can be extremely expensive to defend against these litigations. And this is just one food, and a rather obscure one at that. You can imagine the impact that had on several different industries. And then imagine that all concentrated onto restaurants and retailers who have to deal with several of these different foods. So there's definitely a ton of incentive to obey this law, even if you wouldn't go to jail for it necessarily. As such, if you work in QA, you might have to include tests for lead, arsenic, acrylamide, or other chemicals of a similar nature in the analysis of your foods. And I haven't talked about COAs yet, but we will next week when I talk about nutrition labels. Just think of them as lab reports, really. You may be responsible for helping determine whether or not the food that you're testing warrants the Prop 65 warning and backing that up with data. When you ask suppliers for documentation, you may have to ask them for what's called a Prop 65 letter. Essentially, it's a letter from them stating basically that they take all the steps to prevent any sort of deliberate contamination of any of these chemicals that you see here in any of their products. And there will be a template on Canvas when the time comes. And as I implied prior, even if you're not working in California, this regulation may still be very important because maybe your business does sell to a lot of customers in California. And of course, since you guys are residents of California, you guys will need to know the regulation to some degree when you're working in any capacity here. And that's just a snippet of some of the ways that Prop 65 impacts your work in quality. So what foods and what chemicals apply to this regulation exactly? Well, there are tons. Like I said, there are over 900 different chemicals. So let me just list some of the most common ones and some of the foods that they're in. The first of these is lead. So lead can be found in a lot of different things, but the most common would be vegetables. What would happen is vegetables can be grown in soil, and that soil may have lead contamination in it. One common way this would happen is, say there's a farm that's located not too far away from a factory, and that factory uses a lot of lead, or maybe lead's a byproduct of the process, and that ends up leaching into the soil. And so what could happen is, after doing some lab tests on those vegetables, they might find higher than normal levels of lead in traces of it in the vegetables. Beets, turnips, carrots, a lot of root vegetables especially, they may be exposed to it more than some others, but it's usually safe to say that most vegetables will have that risk. I actually remember seeing a lot of pickle radish products being imported from China, and they would happen to have that Prop 65 warning label on there. So it is very possible that the radishes were grown in soil where there may have been some lead contamination. Balsamic vinegar is another one. Actually, this one kind of surprised me a little bit. I was actually unaware of this, but apparently balsamic vinegars have some risk of lead as well. Another more famous one would be mercury in seafood, especially any sort of fish that are predatory species. So like sharks, tuna, especially bluefin tuna, swordfish, things like that. Why predatory fish in particular? It's more of a biological sort of reason. When a toxin like mercury is introduced into a ecosystem, there might be some level of it in plants, and then that's in turn, so like seaweed, for instance. Well, I guess more produce, but either way, at the bottom of the food chain, the seaweed may have some mercury in it, and then the plankton or the herbivore fish might eat the seaweed. And then those fish are in turn eaten by other fish, and then those fish are eaten by other fish, so on and so on, until we eventually get to the big predators like the swordfish, the tuna, the sharks, the ones that eat a lot of different fish by the truckload. Or maybe not by the truckload, but they eat a lot of them. And so that mercury starts to concentrate at that point. And that is why those particular species of fish would have higher concentrations of mercury than others. And that is why, if there's suspicion of such contamination, a lot of government agencies will discourage the eating of those and encourage the eating of the fish that may be lower on the food chain. Just as a little bonus, a lot of fish sauces that exist, sold by a lot of Thai retail stores or Vietnamese retail stores. Actually, I think oyster sauce too in a lot of Chinese grocery stores. Those basically, in some ways, also concentrate the level of mercury and whatnot in them too. So they have to be concerned about that as well. That's because those sauces, they're made by taking the fish, having them marinate in salt to sort of break down, and then they get boiled and concentrated. Arsenic is another one. Arsenic can sometimes be found in trace amounts in rice, also in seafood, and actually in kelp and seaweed. Some species of seaweed may actually have higher concentrations of arsenic than others. Hijiki seaweed and kombu seaweed are used in a lot of Japanese cooking, especially for soups. They have a lot of MSG flavor. They're kind of used for that umami taste. The hijiki seaweed is a black sort of colored seaweed and is known to have higher levels of inorganic arsenic than kombu does. And so hijiki may more likely need a Prop 65 warning on it, whereas kombu maybe not as likely. If you ever end up working for the nutraceuticals industry, and a lot of food scientists do, a lot of medicines and herbal supplements and stuff like that, they may contain some arsenic traces as well. And traditional medicines in different cultures, yeah, the one that gets quoted for most often for this is traditional Chinese medicine. Obviously, not all of them have it, not even most of them, but there are some specific treatments that do contain arsenic in it. But they're not, by no means the only ones. A lot of other herbal or alternative treatments are not much better. Really, several different cultures might have these, and even some more modern ones created by sort of American companies, they may have it as well. So they all have to sort of heed this regulation. Acrylamide is a big one, and it's one that's actually almost impossible to avoid for the foods that I'm listed here. Acrylamide can come about in a number of different ways. It occurs naturally in some plastics, or maybe not naturally, but as a byproduct. It's a natural byproduct of some cooking methods, especially ones that involve starchy products. Fried potatoes would be a good example. So in this case, potato chips and French fries. Actually, when it comes to potato chips, something like kettle cooked chips, that would actually be worse than like things like Lay's or Pringles. And for French fries, actually, a lot of people like to blame the McDonald's brand, but they're actually lower than some others out there. And I put fried potatoes on here, but really any sort of potato that's cooked at a super high temperature, like a baked roast potato, that could also have acrylamide in it as well. Roasted nuts and roasted coffee, just some sort of seed essentially that's been toasted to a very high temperature. Those can carry some risk of acrylamide too. And actually, these other ones kind of surprised me a little bit. Not so much the baked crackers, because that's basically kind of like the nuts and the potatoes, something very starchy. But apparently, canned pumpkins can actually carry some risk of acrylamide, and so too can prune juice. Now, alcoholic beverages is an interesting one. Um, the regulation actually has separate warning requirements for the ethanol, the chemical, and alcoholic beverages. So ethanol used for, say, laboratory experiments or manufacturing will be labeled differently in the Prop 65 warning from, say, something like whiskey or beer. And so the Prop 65 warning, if you ever have an alcoholic beverage or something that is known to contain alcohol in it as one of the ingredients, you have to list it as an alcoholic beverage. So like alcoholic beverages are known to the state of California to cause cancer, birth defects, or reproductive harm. Listing as ethanol will not count. The last one is bisphenol A or BPA. That can be found on the linings of certain plastic or cans and bottles or certain cartons. That is actually being phased out of the industry, but some containers may still have them. And that's something that carries that risk as well of birth defects or reproductive harm and cancer. So if a container is known to have it, must have that warning. It's actually considered very desirable that containers sold to the food industry do not contain BPA in them. And this is one of the reasons. There are many, many, many more examples, and we could go on forever with all the applicable foods and chemicals, but I think this is good enough for now. Just remember this list for the sake of the quizzes and exams, and just remember that these are the most common examples of what you'll see that will warrant the Prop 65 label. Now, let me talk about one little caveat about this law. As strict and as sweeping as it tries to be, there are actually some exemptions to this rule. If you run a business with less than 10 employees, you are exempt from this rule. That does not mean that businesses that you deal with are also exempt because you were. That can actually play a role in supplier approval programs. A medium-sized 200-employee company may want to start buying turnips from a family business that may have only 9 employees. Now, the 9-employee company, they don't need to worry about anything, at least not as far as Prop 65 is concerned. But what if that bigger company realizes that the turnips have been grown in soil that has been contaminated by lead? Well, if they never accounted for the Prop 65 warning, then they could actually be seen liable in court. And they're the ones that hold the responsibility, not the 9-person company. Next, this regulation makes clear that for certain chemicals, there's a certain tolerance limit that your body can actually withstand without increasing the risk for cancer, birth defects, or other reproductive harm. They acknowledge that sometimes warnings can be excessive. The law has been stipulated such that for certain foods that may apply to this regulation, a consumer may not eat enough of it to actually be exposed to enough of the chemical to increase their risk. and therefore a strong argument can be made that they do not require the label on their products after all. And thus, the OEHHA establishes certain limits in terms of micrograms per day. Pretty strange way of measuring things, I think, but I suppose it makes more sense to an environmental scientist. Anyway, for whatever measurement of micrograms per day is given for a particular chemical, that is considered its safe harbor level. A company can actually be considered protected from this regulation if they happen to have a chemical that applies to Prop 65, but they can prove through calculations and measurements that that chemical is present in levels well below the safe harbor level. I'll give you guys an example. So there's a chemical called 4-MEI, and I'll put the full name up in the text box up there. 4-MEI is a byproduct that's produced in a lot of caramel colorings, especially a lot of older formulas. It's actually a potential byproduct of the Maillard reaction. Some sauces, and especially a lot of dark colas and beers, any really sort of very, very dark sort of beverage with a lot of caramel coloring in it, something like this would be of concern. One of the products sold by the first company I worked at is a yakisoba sauce. So it's a dark sauce that's used for flavoring a certain type of Japanese noodle. And one of the ingredients is caramel coloring. So to determine whether or not we needed to be subject to the Prop 65 regulation, we first checked with Tokyo headquarters just to see if the particular formulation used had 4-MEI in it. And once they confirmed that was the case, we actually calculated how much would be in a typical serving. In the end, we determined that one particular serving of that had just under the limit. So the 4-MEI safe harbor limit is 29 micrograms a day, and we found that one serving of our product had about 15 of it. So it was decided that we would not put that Prop 65 warning on there. Industry groups could also push to have certain chemicals taken off the list. I think the rule is that if a study can prove conclusively that 1,000 times the safe harbor limit cannot cause increased risk of cancer reproductive harm, it could be a candidate for being removed from the list. Here's a California law that some of you might be familiar with, but if you're not, well, I suggest you pay attention, especially if you want to go into the beverage industry. Well, it would be more accurate to call this a fee rather than a law. The California Redemption Value, or CRV, is a regulatory fee paid on recyclable beverage containers in the state of California. In 1986, a bunch of voters decided that it was very important to recycle, and at the same time they managed to convince the legislature that it was an easy way to earn money for the state. And so, that year, the California Beverage Container Recycling and Litter Reduction Act was passed. And that was a key part of that legislation. The fee was, in a sense, a way to implement procedures to try to encourage more recycling. And the beauty of this, at least for the California state government, is that many people don't recycle, and so anything that is not returned or redeemed through this program is pure revenue for the state. You ever wonder why you pay an extra 5 or 10 cents for your drink? This is why. The government imposes this fee on distributors, then they pass that cost onto the retailer, and then finally to you, the consumer. However, you have the opportunity to bring a bunch of those cans to a recycling center or a grocery store and get that money back. You bring in bags of empty bottles and cans, and if you haven't already, you separate them by glass, plastic, and metal. And then the attendant at the recycling center will either weigh all the containers you have or count each one, depending on how many there are total. And then based on those measurements or counts, they give you a certain amount of money. That money is essentially your California redemption or your California cash refund. That's just another name for it. As for exactly how much you, the consumer, are paying right now for each container, that really depends on the size of the container. For any container less than 24 fluid ounces, that's 5 cents per can, and for anything 24 and above, it's 10 cents. Mind you, that's per container. So if you were to buy, let's say, 12 fluid ounces of beer, and you bought a 6-pack of those, you have to pay not 5 cents, but 5 times 6, which is 30 cents. Last but not least, I should mention that the CRV actually only applies to a limited number of containers. The 3 main materials of which they care about are metal cans, usually aluminum, plastic, and glass. And even then, not all kinds of each. The upper limit in terms of applicability to this law is 64 ounces. So big plastic jugs don't count, whereas drinking bottles of water do. Now, out of the 3 things here, I've already mentioned 2 of them. There's one other rule I haven't really talked about. The CRV has been really effective for reducing litter and waste in the state. Or so a lot of advocates for this law claim. I've been told that's proven to be very effective, but honestly, I've been looking for scientific papers on it, and it actually isn't explicitly clear scientifically whether or not it's had a true impact on that. But the CRV is designed for that, and that actually might be something that one of you might consider worth investigating for your essay. But similar programs have proven effective for other states, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So at least on the surface, it seems to make sense that it would help. One other thing I need to say is that CRV is not necessarily a sales tax. That's actually separate from the sales tax. It's not, in the literal sense, considered a tax at all, actually. Whether a beer costs $2 or $5 or $10 if it's a craft beer, the CRV is still 5 cents or 10 cents depending on the size of the can. And if you ever had to do any sort of data entry for like prices and stuff like that, I've had to do that in my first job. You have to treat the CRV separate from the original price as well as the sales tax. Anyway, there's a lot more I could talk about CRV, but we need to move on. So let's move on to the types of drinks it applies to. Right, so even if the drink is under 64 ounces, it doesn't mean it always applies. Milk is a big one. That one is not subject to CRV, even if it's in a bottle that's, like, say, 24 ounces. Pure juices and fruit juices in certain sizes. So for pure vegetable juice in containers bigger than 16 ounce, it's excluded. And the law also does not apply to 100% fruit juices in containers bigger than 46 ounces. I mean, pick up a V8 or a Florida Natural or Tropicana or even just a gallon of milk and just look at the container. You'll not see a CRV on there. Not for most of the containers that they come in anyway. In contrast, things like water, soda, iced tea, those are all fair game for CRV. And alcoholic beverages too. Any alcoholic beverage that is not pure whiskey, pure vodka, pure wine, that would be subject to CRV. For instance, beer. Now, if your drink has wine or hard alcohol, like gin and rum and whiskey, vodka, but has something mixed in it, like juice, then the CRV does apply because now it has something that is applicable in it mixed in. And those are called wine or spirit coolers. Now, how does the CACRV show up on cans exactly? For aluminum cans, like for soda, it's printed on the top. You can see that on the left there. And then for most other containers, like plastic bottles, it'll be on the label. Most frequently under the company information or the barcode. Actually, let me just show you an example real quick. Here's a can of soda I bought. Apologies for the quality. I recorded this on my phone. But you can see the CACRV. That's right there. MI and OR are Michigan and Oregon. And then on the other side, you have the other states there. Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, Hawaii. I think that's Iowa on the right. And not pictured is Connecticut. So yeah, California is not the only state to have this law. For the other states that have it, they have a nickname for it called bottle deposit laws or bottle bills. And it's actually illegal to sell or recycle that product in that state unless it has that marking on there. As for why? Well, the motivation is the same. The goal is to promote recycling, and these fees generate revenue for the state. Any state with a law like this will have recycling centers in most places you go. Other states won't. I actually lived in Pennsylvania for 3 years, so I definitely remember trying to look for a recycling center when I was there. I was initially surprised when I didn't see any, and a little annoyed that I saved all those cans. Was a bit of a culture shock. Anyway, for the ones that do have the bottle deposit laws, they might enforce them differently. The regulations are slightly different. The kind of things that you need printed on there are slightly different. Even the amount of money that's added as the fee for the bottle deposit is different. But for your quizzes and midterms, I wouldn't really be too concerned about the individual differences. Just worry about which states have a bottle deposit law. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the local health departments. So the local health departments, these are your local county departments of public health. So the one near us, of course, is the Los Angeles Department of Public Health. They provide a lot of inspections for a lot of businesses as well, and I kind of mentioned that before. A lot of them will be food safety related. They can either do it pre-scheduled or they often do it by surprise. They just walk through the facility. They tour the facility along with people responsible in quality assurance. They try to just make sure that the buildings and the facility practices are up to code for the local laws. Mainly put up this slide here to note the fact that if you've ever worked in the food industry, say at a McDonald's or a Chipotle or any sort of restaurant in food service, I know many of my former students have. Just know that when it comes to local department health inspections for manufacturing distribution, the process is pretty similar. Other than that, there's nothing really on here that I haven't said already, so let's move on. Food safety evaluations can happen both in companies and by the government. But it's very important to remember the distinctions between the two, especially when it comes to the consequences. An inspector from the private, so from a company, is usually called an auditor. Their inspections are mostly focused on just food safety and food quality. Their standards are often stricter than the government's. And that auditor either comes from a company that wants to buy from you, or it can come from a company that specifically specializes in giving people food safety certifications, like the ISO and SQF and all that. It does suck if you don't pass those inspections, because that means lost business. But those auditors have absolutely no authority to shut you down. Also, with private restaurant and food service auditors do exist, but most of the auditors you'll be dealing with, or even some of you in the future may become auditors yourself, most of them will be focusing on manufacturing and distribution, the industry side of it, and also farms. But again, just either case, most of them will not deal with the restaurant level or grocery store level. Now, contrast that with the government. So the private auditing companies can issue certificates that say that your company meets their certain standards, and that can help you drum up some business. But to start that business at all, you have to go to the government. And in contrast to private auditors, public inspectors actually can take legal action against you, like issuing a notice of violation, taking you to court for something that's other than a lawsuit. They have not just the right, but also the authority and the duty to shut you down if you're in gross violation of the law. Government inspections tend to be slightly easier, at least at the local and state level. But if you do fail those, that can mean your entire facility shuts down temporarily until you fix those problems. Government inspections don't really care about food quality, they only care about food safety. Those inspections might also expand beyond food safety to include business records. They might ask about financial records, they might ask about the identities of certain businesses that you deal with. They may check to see if you have certain permits that are required for your certain operations. And of course, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, they don't just inspect food manufacturing, food warehousing. They inspect things like grocery stores, drugstores, bars, so on and so forth. Alright, so project comments. Out of everything I've talked about today, the most relevant part of this lesson will be the Prop 65 stuff. For tests, Prop 65 is fair game as well. You also are going to definitely be expected to know the difference between a private inspector and a public inspector. And try your best to understand the differences between what is enforced at the national level with the FDA and what people do at the state level. Alright, here are some resources for you guys to use. The YouTube channel has a lot of videos about state regulations in addition to federal that are included on there. As just part of the recommended materials for the YouTube channel. There's an article on Trader Joe's for the ginger candies lawsuit, just as an example of that litigation I mentioned. The OEHHA website, which is the homepage for the Prop 65 regulations, that's on there if you want to take a look. If you want to learn more about hijiki seaweed, I have an article about that, just so you learn a little bit more about the product. For the list of the chemicals that apply to Prop 65, there's a whole list of that, and that's available on Canvas. And if you do any sort of article for your essay related to anything that's at the state or local level for regulations, if you find anything interesting, please send it my way. I'm always open to expanding my library that I can send to other students. As always, if you have questions, leave it in the comments, put them in chat, send out an email to me. I'll be happy to answer those, and I guess I'll see you guys next week.